This is Synopsis, a series of conversations with composers on compositional practice. Today, the guest is Özkan Umutcan Bapbacı. Özkan, welcome, and please shortly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Neža. It's great to be here. As you mentioned, I'm Özkan Umutcan Bapbacı. I'm a composer from Ankara, Turkey. This is my second major because technically I'm also an engineer. I studied engineering before and then started my music studies in composition. I studied in Ankara for my bachelor's, and now I just recently graduated and will be pursuing my master's later on. I'm generally a composer who's very much interested in stage works, vocal works, performative arts, and many other extra musical elements. And I'm also very much interested in working with electronics and somehow bringing together with the acoustic mediums, which I'm sure we'll be talking about later, probably. Basically, this is who I am, I would say.
So an inevitable question, do you see your engineering expertise in any way influencing the way you work in composition?
I just should hope so, because then I would think that I wasted my 4 years with engineering. But I always think that this is somehow, in the very beginning, I was very afraid because I knew I wanted to do music, I wanted to do composition as the primary profession in my life. But I was always scared because this is for me a very different change of lines, engineering and music. But then I came to realize that there are a lot of things that can help me from my engineering past. One of the most clear ones, for example, is to somehow approaching to work with electronics, because a certain kind of musical algorithms, or for example, max MSB or certain kind of coding algorithms that are very easier to approach if you have a certain little bit of a background in coding or engineering and stuff like that. So I would say that it helps. And also, to a certain extent, I think analytical thinking and this kind of categorization really helps with compositional approach, at least in my case. I really hope that 4 years of engineering education was not for nothing, and it helps me with my composition.
Yeah, because the structuredness of engineering, I imagine, should come very handy when composing and when how to do structuring your own compositional practice. Speaking of practice, what do you see as, let's say, being a part of the structure of your compositional practice, compositional processes? How do you see, if you have that, if you ever thought of that, how do you see what consists, what does it consist of?
This is, for me, it's a very broad concept also, because in my musical output, I always somehow get influenced by certain extra musical elements. So apart from my own already established compositional process, which starts with an idea, with sketches, and then moving on to material working out, and then finalizing and concluding. So this is like almost in all of my pieces existing, process of composition. But apart from that, I would say in every single composition, I somehow get influenced by something extra musical. Of course, it doesn't necessarily have to be. Sometimes I really just sit down and I say, I have to write something, so I just write it. But sometimes, you read something, you hear something, or you see some visual arts or performative art, or you read something about the history, which happens to me a lot, when you walk around in the museum and then you see this one historical element. So all these kind of things, I think, really guide me in my compositional processes. And this becomes more clear also lately when I was creating this portfolio, for master's applications and everything. I came to realize that this is really apparent in my compositional output, that almost every single project has something new in terms of techniques, but also in terms of the dramaturgy and the background. It always has a certain kind of association with something. So that's why I think I rarely, entitle my composition as composition for this and this instrument. So I always give it a certain kind of a title although it is not necessarily programmatic anyways, I just like to have a certain kind of influence, I think, from extra musical elements. Yeah.
So you work with this distinction between programmatic music, perhaps something that is more thoroughly rooted in a certain, perhaps a text or something else, and simply as you qualified, taking something extra musical as a reference, as something. Would you call that a subject matter or
Yeah, I mean, that's actually very nice description of it. But of course, as I said, not necessarily, because now the term that you approach to it can really change the way you handle the material. I mean, it can be a subject matter. For example, I have this duo project. It's one of the earlier works that I composed for voice and clarinet. And the title is The Lighted Window. And because it directly comes from the poem that I'm using, entitled The Lighted Window. So this is exactly the similar thing. But of course, there are other things. For example, I'm very much interested with opera, especially the Puccini operas. I mean, I even did my internship in opera academy, so it's just like something very important for me. And during that time, I was really fascinated with Puccini's Trittico, these three operas that has different kind of characteristics. And my string quartet is directly coming from it. So this kind of influences can either be subject material, or it can be material that you reference to, or you just take the general characteristics and work it out. So as I said, I think this could be definitely a subject material as you described. This is definitely one of the ways, but also I think it is one of the ways that can be many other things, as I mentioned.
In this quartet, you also go through three very different, how to say it, sound worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Okay. That's correct, because that's the thing. I mean, we were producing in this internship, I think it's summer 2022, it was in Berlin, and we were producing two of the three, Trittico operas. We were doing Suor Angelica and Giannis Kiki, and then every single day I was hearing it. And then this was the time that I had to write my quartet, and I was like, I have to do something with it, because otherwise it's just not going to get out of me. It's just like it was always with me somehow. So this is how I approached it. I mean, really basically just as similar as Il Trittico has three operas different in characteristics, my string quartet also has three movements with a prologue and epilogue that separates these three movements. So yeah, three movements are different from each other. They have certain quotations from these operas, but also they are very different, as you mentioned, in terms of sound worlds. It's really distinctive, three different sound worlds, which is, as I said, an inspiration I get from the works that I was associated with. Yeah.
And it seems like it takes us back to where we started, which is the structure. In this case, I guess. ABC.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I would say that I think whenever I talk about my music, this becomes one of the most important things, because form and general structure is very important for me. Like whenever I start a work, also this is one of the main starting points for me. I talk about the general macro structure, and then I go deeper and deeper. Not necessarily it's that all of my music has a clear structure with like movements with ABC numbers, but really more that it's also in two ways. I think first, for me it's like a compositional process. Whenever I think about form, I started to envision the piece more clearly. And also, of course, in terms of how I want to walk within the piece, the form always helps. And I think, as you mentioned, this, the analytical engineering thinking past of me really helps out with this, because form in all these pieces, for me, I would say, is very important characteristic. Yeah.
And as much as generalizations aren't something I feel comfortable at, but probably one could say that form in composition in general is one of the cardinal parts of it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I'm sure there are a lot of composers who would disagree with this, and I love them dearly. Obviously, everyone has.
Who would disagree?
I mean, I have no idea. I don't want to. What I would say is that I know many composers who are not that much interested in form because they have other concerns. Because composition has. I think unlimited possibilities that you can focus on. And for me, maybe it's one way of, characteristic of each composer. For me, form is very important, but I know it doesn't have to be necessarily always the,
Of course.
most important. But I would
However,
say that it helps.
yeah,
So,
I mean, we are up to a large extent, I think, still basing, I mean, our context for this is in the end the canon of Western classical music.
yeah.
So that's the whole context. I think when we go there, the form
Yeah.
and the structure are quite high. And when you say there's limitless possibilities. However, do you see a certain composition to be universal, to be something that will always be present in composition? Do you have a notion of composition and a view to it as perhaps universal or as something that is particular?
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely, I think, something that almost one way or the other every composer thinks about, because I think we are composing and we are putting our output out there, and we kind of want to hope maybe that this will be something that resonates with people and this will stick around and this will inspire people, so on, or maybe even with some other concerns, but we just put it out there for other people to view it. And I did a lot of research about this actually, because I mentioned I'm really fascinated with opera, and then I was thinking, why are some operas are extremely liked? I mean, liked in the sense that not people really liked it or anything, but they just stick around basically. And for example, one interesting thing that we can think about is that this, like, if you look at the 20th century, especially after Puccini's death, you do not see any operas that stick around. Like I mean, for example, Puccini writes one opera and definitely it becomes a repertoire opera immediately. So now I'm imagining a contemporary opera who would stick around and becomes this much resonated with the audience, but it's really difficult to find out this kind of works. So I would say there are definitely some elements in composition that helps them to be universal, not in terms of only universal in the geography, but also in time. They just stick around for some reason.
Because
So I would say
Puccini's operas stuck around already as he was alive, right?
absolutely. I mean, this
Yeah.
is the thing. As I mentioned, this was one of the last things that I worked on before graduating in bachelor's. I was looking at this 20th century modern opera, and there's even this one term is called like the post-Puccini crisis in opera, because the musicologists and the music critics, or whoever you say, the people who think about this, they say if you look at it, Puccini writes one opera and it gets a premiere everywhere, in US, in Paris, in Germany, in Austria. But now, for example, after Puccini, it's really difficult for a contemporary opera to stick around and become a repertoire opera. So it's very difficult. Even then, we have these amazing operas today, like from Sarajevo, from Chernovin, also
Exactly.
much
Even though
earlier.
they are performed as well
Yeah,
in
yeah,
London, New York,
yeah,
and
absolutely. But you
Oslo.
don't, I mean, especially in the second half of the 20th century, early 21st century, it's really difficult to see this one opera becoming this like generally praised, repertoire opera. They usually become like projects that the opera houses or the concert houses they're initiating. But then after this project is over, they are unfortunately very rarely performed. So this is, I think, one of the interesting things that a composer should definitely think about. Not that because we need to put out music that it should be praised immediately, and just that's not the case. But I think in your question, which is I think very important, definitely there are certain aspects in composition that enables them to be universal and being timeless, as you mentioned.
And what would those aspects be then? What do you
Yeah.
see as?
Well, it's very difficult. I wish I knew it. Then it would be very
And
helpful as a
we can
composer.
call it speculative,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
and also, just to preface it,
mhm,
it's also what is composition practice
mhm.
is addressing these kind of questions. Can that be a part of composers' formation? To
Yeah.
understand. Mm.
I mean, this is definitely important, because I think to define the the reasoning behind composition, it's also very difficult because we can almost talk
Yeah.
about the compositional process. I do the form, I do the material work, but then the question comes, and this is one of the most difficult questions I think to ask, like, why do you compose? And then this hits me, and then it's very difficult. I know the most obvious answer for me, because this also came to me a couple of times before, is the reason that I knew I had to compose. I do not know any other way. I cannot explain. There's no logical explanation that this is the reason I'm composing. For example, this can never be the reason, I would say, just that because we talked about this topic just a few minutes ago. It's not that I want to produce an opera that will be immediately loved by everyone and it's going to be a like traditional repertoire opera. This cannot be. I think for today's composer, this is hardly can be a motivation. But as I mentioned, this is difficult to answer apart from just saying that I had to do it. There's no other way. I do not know how to describe it. I just knew I had to compose. This is one aspect. And then if you look at the other aspect, which is then, okay, you're composing, but what could be the materials or what could be the components that will enable your composition to be this universal or somehow sticking around, in terms of time-wise compositions? It's very difficult. I think these two questions, as you already know, I think because you said also speculative, they are very difficult to answer to. But one thing that I could say, because this was also one thing I was thinking about, I'm sorry, I'm just going to talk about opera a lot in this
Please. Yeah.
talk, but so one other thing that I was thinking about this the other day. So I know I watched, for example, Puccini's Tosca many times. I watched it in Turkey. I watched it in the big stages in Europe. I watched it in online streamings, etc. So at least I think I probably saw maybe around 15 different productions by many different singers. And still, I know what's happening at the end. I know many people who watch Tosca know what's happening in the end, or in the middle, or in the beginning. But still, somehow, when you watch it, you keep watching it. And one answer that I could find about is that because of the action on the stage. So even though you know what is happening at the given moment, there's such kind of a strong dramaturgy and action that it just makes you want to watch it. So no matter how the narrative is very obvious and you know what's happening, I think this is one of the main reasons. The action that kind of flows continuously without interruption. This is definitely one of the reasons why we still watch or observe these operas and still being attracted by them, because this is human nature. You're just witnessing something that is continuously flowing, and you do not just stay and thinking, I know what's happening in the end. You just become one part of it because it's such a continuous flowing and energetic action. And this is what I would say definitely one of the components of that thing that we mentioned.
I mean, and in the end, it's not about knowing what's in the end, but anyway, I'm guessing if you go to see an opera, you're even an opera connoisseur, and you know what happens. You're still there if the production is good, if the performance is a performance, then you can let go and perhaps follow the line of evoked emotion that, for example, the opera does, and feel all the sadness, surprise, or joy, despite knowing where it's going or at which point of the narrative it is.
Yeah.
But
I think that's
still,
what makes it very universal, as you mentioned, because you know what's happening, and it's not about the fact that you know what's happening, but it's because you are witnessing it as part of this continuous flow, and then you don't even think about the narrative or anything. And this is why I think opera has been really one of the main art forms for so long in the music history. But if you look at it after, especially the first half of the 20th century, it became like a big decay. Now there's amazing works, of course, many different versions of approaching to opera, but I think this is something that we still have a lot of thing to experiment. And I think many composers do it today, which is, I think, fascinating for that. New music, I think, now really embraces more than ever, I would say, the stage works, the performative works, the operas, and whatever branches that can come out of it, So Jennifer Walsh, for example, has this online operas with this, puppets and video projection, which is extremely interesting. So I would say that this is something definitely going to be more explored, I would say.
And since we're discussing opera, what about the entertainment part of it? Since I mean, when thinking of Puccini's operas,
Mhm.
it's also entertaining.
Of course.
Which is, it seems sometimes today almost like taboo, you know, for music or compositional or serious composition to be entertaining. What about that aspects of opera?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important question, I would say, because I also feel like a lot of people in the new music scene are asking, I mean, even maybe not answering it, but definitely asking about it. It's just somehow, I feel like the new music scene kind of made peace with this in the last couple of maybe decades. I'm not sure. I mean, I cannot really, I'm not an authority on this, but I'm just kind of seeing this because, I, for example, attended Darmstadt summer course last year in the latest edition of the summer courses in Darmstadt. And there I met a lot of composers who are actually open to bring out this element of somehow entertaining. Entertaining in the not the sense of, you're watching a soap opera and you entertain and you're just like brain melts for hours and hours, but somehow it kind of enables you to associate and interact with the piece. And this is, I think, very important for us because, I mean, today's audience, it's really impossible to really connect with the audience unless you find a way to do it. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the new music scene kind of made its peace with it. The kind of fact the entertainment can be a part of new music, definitely. But also I think this shouldn't, and I'm sure this is not, but I'm just saying it as a very general thing, you know, just exploring new sonic possibilities, exploring new ways of telling things, or exploring form, or exploring different parameters in music. These are not always necessarily going to be entertaining because sometimes these are definitely difficult to understand. So it's not going to be easily graspable immediately. So I think this is also something very important that composers keep doing it. But as I mentioned, this is somehow bringing these two ends together. Something can be very serious, but and somehow exploring new possibilities while also enabling audience to join it and be a part of it. So this is why I think these two worlds can somehow collide and make a more, I don't know how to say, but yeah, approachable work of art, I would say.
I guess could the crucial word here be what you mentioned, association
Yeah,
with
yeah.
the compositional work? Uh, Perhaps also paralleled to understanding, because my thought is also a overused theme in new composition, new music is understanding it, understanding the music. Does, for example, association on the other part doesn't really need understanding. It can be intuitive. It can be
Absolutely.
subconscious, right?
Absolutely.
That's why.
Yeah,
That's
I
why it
definitely,
seems like
yeah.
a great term here,
Yeah,
perhaps.
I think it's important because really this is something that I learned actually very, yeah, I mean, earlier in my bachelor studies because I was composing this piece for solo flutes, and this I wanted to work with some algorithmic composition methods. Like all the pitches and their durations and the form was coming from the certain, almost like the Xenakis kind of approach to the structure making and pitch making. And then I presented this piece. It was performed. I was happy with it. And then one of my colleagues asked me, I mean, you talked about all these processes, but do you want audience to understand the process, or do you want audience to somehow associate with the piece? And I think this was exactly what you're mentioning about, because I feel like all these noble pursuit of new things, explorations of timbre, sonic capabilities, different mediums, form, I think these are all pursuits for composer, but in the end, the way you bring them together and present it to the outer world, it doesn't necessarily be for the audience. Audience does not need to understand your algorithm in composition. Rarely they do. I mean, even the most trained musicians, they can really rarely understand the algorithm that's preceding your work. So I think these two things are definitely different from each other. Pursuing some technique and going through this very important road that we definitely need to go, versus what you expect from audience to understand from them. If you go to this end, this is rarely going to happen that immediately an audience can grasp what you want to do, understand your algorithm, understand your technical capabilities behind the work, etc. So I think this is something really important, as you mentioned. Yeah. It's
Right,
true.
because understanding perhaps then pertains more to the technique part, to the, as you said, process.
Yeah.
However, I mean, my question is here: how did it come to that? Because not only that, I will generalize. We
Mhm.
composers write in a way that the composition is mostly interesting from this perspective, if you're looking into how it was made, but
Mhm.
also so often the audience members say, this is, I don't understand this, you know, that's why I cannot listen to it, because I don't understand it. So how did it, perhaps a bit of a, you know, diversion, but how did it get to this, that everyone's in new music, that everyone is so obsessed with something that is not necessarily one of the essentials of the performance as a musical performance?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult for me to answer. I was just up from this question by saying that I've only been studying for the last 4 years. I was an intern before, but really, this is a difficult question to answer. But really, I would say that I don't know what happened before, but I can see what's happening right now because I know many wonderful composers, colleagues. They're working towards pushing this this profession further, which is, as I mentioned, this is really important, and you also would agree on this, I'm sure. But also, I think they came to realize that this is not necessarily the only thing that they need to focus on. I think these times of, somehow describing new music, the new music that we know, obviously, it doesn't necessarily have to be academical music. Because I remember when I first actually approached for the composition profession, they were separating it and they were saying the academic music, the the contemporary music, the new music that people were composing for academy. And this kind of a distinction, I think, is really kind of getting loose, which is, I think, really important and nice. And but as I said, this is something we definitely pursue, the new possibilities, of course. But this is, I think, understood today that this is not the only thing that composers are going after.
Mm-hmm.
How it came to it, I cannot answer, unfortunately. But it's a yeah, good answer.
So a theme that has been coming to the surface in a couple of these conversations has been what I will now address in perhaps a bit of a different light, hence um, program notes. That's where this comes from. And specifically, today, and this is almost like a thesis, becoming a small thesis now. Today, there's so many different uh, musics, you know? Let's say that's the hypothesis. Basing on that, how can everyone prepare the same format or same program notes? It sounds a little bit banal, just bear with me.
Of course.
So, you know, everyone gets this demand, write the program note. And what's, what we got to was that perhaps it should be accepted, more widely accepted, that there will be some compositions where there just shouldn't be any program notes, and then there will be others where perhaps one should read a book, you know, to understand it or to listen to. So let's say two extremes, for example. However, what I want to ask you is uh, perhaps we can address this from a different perspective, specifically, perhaps this demand for program notes comes from a place of needing to place the work in a larger total of something. And since um, often it will happen that the person that will come to listen does not know anything about the composer they will listen to.
Mhm.
So I found it a good idea to perhaps start, you know, anyway, this conversation, you know, when someone hears this conversation, hears a lot of, you know, your views, your practice, how you conceive of composition. I'm guessing already this can give, you know, one an idea so that they will go and perhaps have more chance of both understanding and association with recording of your music, for example. But just to go for this question more systematically, what would you say of your practice of your composition? You already, let's say, you already told us a lot of things. Perhaps, what do you see as your life work in composition? Mm-hmm. And having that, you know, as an entry point into listening to the music that you composed. What do you see your, even if you never thought of this, or if you have it very worked through already, what do you see as your live composition project?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is very important, and I definitely put some thoughts about this. In fact, when I was graduating, I mean, really just very recently, I needed to prepare this portfolio, which in there I needed to provide an artistic statement, which this was definitely one of the points that I wanted to touch upon. Like, if an audience observes my music, what would they hear, what would they experience, or what I would hope for them to, because this is, you know, impossible for composers to dictate what the audience will feel or hear or experience, of course. But I would say there's like really three main characteristics that my live compositions hope to bring for the audience. The first thing is, I think, the first thing that we talked about in this discussion as well together. It's the extra musical elements and other fields of art somehow influencing my work. So somehow you will experience, I would hope so, that this is what I'm hoping for, that you have a multi-layer approach to it, that this is not only the sonic explanation, but also certain kind of a maybe narrative or a distorted narrative or something that is extra musical that influenced me, because this is how I compose. This is not something that I hope for. This is how it comes. This is my process, as we talked about this. The second thing is a bit more technical, but I would feel important. It's that I really like the audience to be treated not as an audience. You know, this is something that I think a lot of people talked about this before in terms of composition. You know, what do we expect from an audience? Because in the traditional sense of concert situation, we have a stage, we have the performers, and then we have an audience. We expect them to enter, sit down, listen to it, clap, and then leave the concert hall. So this is very traditional. But what I want to do is somehow try to distort this. You know, one of my very, very dear teachers, he is working on this concept called the ritualistic drama. And I really, really love this concept. And with that, with some of my other friends as well in the composition department, I'm personally as well very much interested in the idea of a ritual. So I don't want audience to be this audience from this romantic period of time, this concert-going audience, but I want them to be a member of this ritual almost that we're performing on the stage. It doesn't have maybe any spiritual background to it, but somehow it enables audience to be a part of it. And for that, as I mentioned, I'm bringing this electronic mediums with the acoustic mediums. For that, for example, I'm using a lot of sound specialization so that some of the sounds are not only coming from your face, but it's, you know, going around you so that you feel like you're in somehow this occurrence, so you're a part of it. This is what I'm trying to hope for. And the last one is obviously the collaboration, because I think nowadays, of course, we have this big obsession as composers that whatever we put on the paper when we write it, this is what we want. But I think this rarely happens. Even in, I think, the traditional music, this rare, because we have something called interpretation. If we listen to two violinists playing two different Brahms concerto, then we would say these are two different interpretations, although the material is the same. Obviously, this is what Brahms wrote. But we would say, I think, even for today's music, we should be open to collaboration. As composers, we should be open what the new interpretations of the music we already scheduled, planned, you know, prepared for them. So this is the other aspect for me. I really enjoy collaboration and getting ideas and enabling concert situations to give rise to new, you know, things that are somehow maybe not expected from the composition. But I would also like to embrace them. So these three topics, I would say, are the live experience that I'm generally constructing my compositions around, I would say.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. And
But the program notes, this is also a very important topic. I mean, if you'd like to talk about,
go
because I
ahead.
feel it's very difficult, because I was also thinking about this lately. Like, when I first started, because I'm studying, obviously I'm learning a lot. My teachers always said you need to write your program notes, and I would of course always write it. But then after a while, I was feeling that I'm explaining how I composed it, almost like giving like a recipe to whoever is going to play the piece, not even most of the time to the audience, because if it's not going to be a concert situation. So then I thought sometimes, for example, I would give like 2 sentences from this poem that I was inspired from, or like this visual that I inspired from, etc. So as you mentioned, I think this program notes, they do not have to be one thing. This could be many other things, or do not exist at all, I think, as you mentioned in some pieces. This is, yeah, I wanted to also join you in this idea, which I find important.
Great. So, I have a question for the first point where you were mentioning the multi-layered approach.
Yeah.
And that should be, let's say, that you would like that to be clear. And with that, and already before, there was the mention of the extra musical. This is another very curious question for me. Extra music, what is music, and what is the
Yeah, I mean,
what is
yeah, this is.
what does not, or what is the relation of extra musical to the musical? What makes something extra musical? How do you conceive of that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, this would be a nice point to give a disclaimer that all the things that I said here, they're all about me. I have no claim of this is how it's done. And because this is, I think very important, because I know people would be very fiercely against what I would describe as extra
No,
musical.
you're basing it on your own
Absolutely,
practice.
my own perception,
Yeah,
definitely. So
yeah.
yeah, but I would say for me, the extra musical is that things that really does not immediately necessarily associate itself with music. For example, whenever I would compose something and I'm in the process and I'm thinking about, for example, the harmony, the timbre, the structure, they are really, for me, the musical elements. They do not have any necessary relations to something else. But for example, when I'm talking about, let's say, the form or the narrative or somehow the inspiration that I have to write this piece, this is what I would consider as extra musical, these things that fascinate me. For example, some composers I know, they're fascinated with certain sonic materials they just collect from the nature, and then they analyze it and they try to somehow work on this material to construct their orchestration or their work. This is something I wouldn't requirely say that it's extra musical, because this is really sound related and then you're basing your own perception on this. But for me, for example, reading a book or reading a poem or watching a play, seeing a visual description of something, or even like a light show or something in the nature, that for me wasn't really about music or sound or whatever I conceive, you know, as the center of my profession, which is composition, then I would kind of regard this as extra musical, certain kind of narratives that doesn't necessarily have any relation to the sounds that are going to be displayed within. So this is how I kind of define the extra musical, like having a poem that has no relation to the music, for example, but then I'm taking it and using it to create a composition which is influenced by an extra musical element, I would say.
So it's basic. Perhaps one could say that not all poems, but in this composition where this certain poem was taken as a fascination, inspiration, it
Absolutely.
becomes a part of it.
Yeah.
Do you think it could be slightly abstracted in a way where you would say that also this, fascination with this way of composing with extra musical elements, because it's many composers work like that. Do you think that it is the that there's some part of the brain, and I'm no neuroscientist, but do you think there's a part of the brain that is simply triggered by some inputs of different kind, or perhaps also of the sonic nature, or visual nature, or experiential nature. That when that is triggered, when there's that perhaps that certain connection, perhaps even in your term association, is achieved with something, no matter its nature, then you can transform it into and apply into a composition. What do you think is this process?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point because I also think this is something always embedded in the concept of composition. This is not new, I would say. The
Yeah.
things that are out of place being used, and then it somehow triggers the human nature. For example, one very important thing that it was also I use in many of my works as well is the whisper. For example, whisper, of course, nowadays we're using it so often and so widely that we wouldn't say whisper is something new into the new music world, obviously. But I would say whisper is something so personal to the human nature that whenever you're encountering it, this triggers something, I would say, for me personally, that it always triggers something very intimate. And for example, when I mentioned about this like surround space and creating a special area for the audience to be in, I always, for example, use the whisper very close to the audience, not coming from here that you see the person whispering, but the whisper just coming from around you. And this, I think, is a very intimate and different feeling that will create a different kind of experience for the observer of it. So that's why I really feel like this kind of I would say this extra musical or not really associated with the music or the sound itself, this kind of parameters or components, they really open up a different world for audience to also explore different things within. So I think this is definitely correct, that I think this really triggers something very humane within us, that we just experience something else than what necessarily was brought to us.
Does that mean that a composer, or for you, let's say you as a composer, needs to have a very clear or just a very strong and deep understanding of certain, first of all, human nature, and of how the perhaps this is a question of how the reception of the piece of a musical composition, because now you mentioned whisper, and you incorporated whisper into this piece with both electronics and with flute, and knowingly what kind of association this carries in average human, let's say. Although this is such a basic human sound that and that is so inextricably connected with certain closeness,
Absolutely, yeah.
even intimacy, and so you knew this and perhaps integrated it to, as you said, to have something, some impact on that with the music. How important is in general to, when we speak of association with the composition, to also, like, is this the point where in compositional practice human nature becomes from extra musical to musical?
Yeah, I would argue so. I think this is really, what you describe is really close to what I have in mind whenever I use, one thing what I mentioned was whisper, but of course there's many other things. For example, even shouting is one of them, because a person shouts when it's in big distress or something that is out of ordinary is happening, or out of love, happiness, or somehow fear or whatever. So all these kind of things are very naturally belonging to the human characteristic. But what you said, I think, is really important here, there are, I think, whatever I can see is that two main aspects the way we can approach it. One is, for example, whisper is being treated as a sonic character. So, of course, whispering has a very distinctive sonic character. You can explore this, you can, combine it with different syllables and making it, shape in a different way. And this would provide you with only for the sonic character and material that you can manipulate. This is wonderful, and I think this is one of the great ways to treat this act, for example. But there's another way, for example, that you can approach it, which is, as you mentioned, whisper as connected as it is into the human nature. We hear whisper when something is very intimate happening, or we whisper when we're hiding from something, or we're hiding from someone, or whatever. So these kind of associations, they are very human. So I think, as you mentioned, these two ways you can first, of course, you can hope that audience will grasp it. There is no guarantee, but since this is such a natural element, natural phenomena, the audience can grasp it. Or the second thing is that you don't expect the audience to grasp it, but you just put it there. Because it's such a natural thing, it will somehow resonate with them. Even though it's not the way that you intended to resonate with the audience, it will have a certain kind of effect. Even though you use it for whisper, for the sonic quality, or whisper for the dramaturgy or the theatrical element, it will somehow bring an association with the audience. Because thinking that your audience is the human that experiences this work. So I think this is definitely true, that you can hope for it, expect for it, or just put it there, and whatever comes out of it will have a natural interaction with the human existence of the audience, of course.
Although, because when you say it will have an effect, even if not that one, I'm guessing this is where it can get very delicate also. Because, there's a... Also, when we... I don't know if you've noticed this, but how often the new musics are associated with horror movies.
Yeah.
Did you see this phenomena?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm not sure if there's a strict study about this or like a paper, but one thing I know is that recently I saw Long Legs. This is like very new. I'm not sure if I can say it, but yeah, this like new movie that just came out. I think 8th of August. I think 5 days ago or something. So we went there to watch the movie, and the first thing that I realized was the harmonics from the string, and then the scratch coming on. I was like, and people were like, "Oh, this is like," and I was like, "Okay, guys, this is like a basic like contemporary music concert. If we go to, and I love this because this is something very interesting. This is, I think, what I wanted to talk about. This, the thing that is out of the context or out of ordinary. For example, we do not expect like a violin, as normal people, I would say, normal people who has no association with contemporary music, we do not expect violin to create a scratch noise. We would expect it to create like very beautiful, but with the scratch, it's out of ordinary. And I think this gesture has something that is, this being out of ordinary has something important to give to the audience. That's why I really don't enjoy, I would say this, I think, because yeah, I say it to everyone around me all the time. I really have a hard time somehow connecting with the pieces that are almost looking like a catalog of extended techniques. So for me, this becomes like, this is not what we are trying to explore right now, guys. I think we already explored this, like in the post half 20th century. People explored this, capabilities of instruments, everything like the extended techniques. But I think this is not something that we need to just put out there just to be able to say that we are composing contemporary music. We're doing scratch, we're doing whisper, we're doing... This is not the thing for me personally, I would say, because I find hard time connecting to such, compositions. I would say for me, the extended techniques are not the goal that you're trying to reach as a composer or, as an artist, but this is some kind of a material that you manipulate so that you can achieve something that you want to able to achieve in the end. So this is like a very cheesy way to say that extended techniques are not the ends but the means or something. So this is what I would say. But I really agree with you. This kind of out of ordinary approach to the sonic material can be really associated with horror movies because they want this shocking future to be associated with it. And this was the last thing that I very recently was thinking about this in this movie. So I definitely agree with that.
I mean, is that perhaps simply the result? I'll have to check up on my music history knowledge here, but a result of these kind of extended techniques, especially let's say on strings. everyone knows, as you mentioned, scratch, or is it a result of that first being introduced to mainstream audiences through horror movies? Not in, do you think this would be different? Of course, there's also this fact of a dissonance there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Dissonance
that's,
as we know it, of
yeah,
course.
we needs to be noted. But still, it seems like this scratch and these kind of techniques were first heard in this specific context. And perhaps I'm completely off here, but it's just, as you said, it's probably most of composers today will know about this association. And that's why I was talking about how delicate it at some point becomes if the association is made, but to something very different, because these pieces that are associated are not, I think I dare say, in more than most of them are not intended to be horrifying.
No, yeah, obviously.
And perhaps this is then the, unintended association that carries big implications for a listener's reception of the composition.
Yeah.
And perhaps, since we were addressing what could be qualified as universals of composition that, as you said, sticks, that is re-performed, that people want to hear. Perhaps, some control over association could be a factor, because what do you think? Did Puccini intend the pieces that are tragic to be tragic, and the parts that are funny to be funny?
Yeah.
I think so.
I think, yeah, in the end, I would say really it's about what we talked about before. It's the human nature. I think what really applies to what they want to create is really applying to the human nature. And in the end, once it resonates with the people, they just would want to have more of it. And as I mentioned, like as a contemporary composers, we do not have necessarily this ambition of being the composer who's always being played, who is always sticking around. This, as I said, this cannot be the motivation for us. But this could be something that we can learn, so that this could be an element that we manipulate and make it something else, that even though without forgiving about exploring different sonic and structural capabilities, we can still try and manage to associate with the audience. I think this is something that can be really looked onto and it really apply for the 21st century composer who's right now producing works, because as you said, like once a composer knows what will associate with the audience, and if it also aligns with what he or she wants to do, then it will work out in the end, both for the audience and for the composer. I would definitely.
Yeah, and then also if a composer's working with association in a way where they're, let's say, the composer, he or she doesn't want none, or doesn't or the composition of the composer doesn't consist of any, and then that's also probably that's the most demanding task ever, though.
And that's wonderful too. I think, as we mentioned, this is like really somehow what I feel closer to my profession, but I'm also very much interested into, not having a narrative, not having something that is obvious for people to listen to and say, yeah, this was what it is. Of course, this is not something we pursue, but these are two different things. The end goal doesn't necessarily have to be the music that is in no way approachable or in no way associated with the audience. This is, I think, one of the different ways to do it. But of course, as you mentioned, anything is possible. Anything can be the motivation, anything can be end goal, and they're all valid, which is the beautiful thing about
Okay. Anything is possible, you said.
Absolutely.
What is Özkan's dream opera? What
Okay.
will we hear in 10 years?
Yeah.
What will that be like? There
Yeah.
will be
It's
like already 50 operas, and after
no, no,
that
no. I'm just hoping that
we
I would
hear
be
the
able to. Yeah, I'm just hoping that I will be able to do one,
no.
and not necessarily called an opera even, but something that is going to be close to what all we talked about these things.
Hmm.
That I'm just hoping to have one that I can say this is what I wanted to do because yeah,
Hmm.
this is really for me something that I enjoy so much. And also one of the things, because now I'm in Turkey and I have studied here, and we'll see what the future is going to bring. I don't know what's going to happen, etc. But the thing is, because I'm so interested in opera, I always try to go to the opera house here in Ankara and try to always. And then I come to realize there's a lot of things to explore there, even in the international opera houses that doing crazy things, and everything is to the limits, etc. There's still things missing, and I think one of the biggest things that are missing is the contemporary operas that are just being written for today's audience to be put in the repertoire and to be repeatedly being performed. I mean, this is what we already talked about before. Of course, like works from Chernovin, from Sarajevo, of course, they are being performed in many different countries, many different stages, but just that not as projects, but as repertoire operas, it's very difficult to see them. So this is what I really want to invest more time in my compositional future, hopefully. So I don't know if in 10 years you would see an opera from me, because I
I'll
have
be
no idea
already
what it
in
would
two
look like.
years. I know, I know, I know.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'll let you know immediately if I do. But yeah, in the end, I would say that this is, as a composer, definitely one of the things that I'm focused at.
Mm-hmm.
And just even to do a research about it, talk about it, it's somehow inspiring for me. So I think
Yeah.
it's good to, yeah, go through
Well,
this.
I'm looking forward to hearing that.
Yeah,
And,
me too. Thank you.
and since we're approaching the end, I'll just ask you for uh, two quick messages. One for uh, anyone at the beginning of the compositional practice of composition, and the other as a message to anyone that will, after this, go and hear performances of your works, what you
Mhm.
would message to them.
Yeah, I mean, the first one I would still say that I'm at the very beginning of my compositional career, to be honest. So I would say just like, let's go, you guys. I mean, I don't know, just going through and yeah, working. I mean, one thing that as I mentioned, that looking at my portfolio at the very end of my studies, I realized that at every single work, I always try to do one thing new, like one thing technically, one thing with electronics, one thing with stage, one thing with voice, etc. So I think this is important, although in the end this will create like almost a confusion of an output. I think this is always good, because without trying, just by observing it, it's impossible to say that you know what it is. You have to do it, you have to try it, you have to hear it, so that in the end you know if you like to do it or not to do it again. So I think this is something very important. Just instead of sticking to one certain way of doing things, just go through and see what other possibilities are available for you, and then in the end, I think, I'm sure it's going to blend into one compositional output that you will say that this is mine, I would say.
And if nothing else, you will know how, for what kind of lights to ask for performance of your piece.
Absolutely, that's absolutely true. Lights are very important. I had a lot of problems with it, but yeah, that's definitely true.
All right.
Without trying, it's impossible to know. And for anyone out there who would like to listen to my works, I would just say thank you. This really makes me happy if you'd like to listen to them. And as I said, just for me, I do not dictate anything for audience to hear. I just, all these inspirations, all the techniques, all the extra musical or musical elements that I'm using, they're all for me, and whatever I put out there, it's for them. So this relationship I can just try to initiate but cannot dictate. So there's probably, I would say, nothing I can say apart from just saying enjoy or thank you.
Great. So this was another episode of Synopsis, Conversations with Composers in the framework of Abeceda Institute. Today was speaking Özkan Umutcan Bapbacı. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great time to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.